welcome back. So, before the break I started talking about derivatives, and I introduced derivatives as financial instruments which derive their value, which obtain their value from another financial instrument, from the value or the price process of another financial instruments. We also discussed how mathematically we can represent the price of a derivative at any particular instant as the discounted value, the present value of the expected future cash flows arising from the derivative at the maturity of the contract. That expected value having to be calculated with respect to a special set of probabilities which we call risk neutral probabilities. We shall talk about all this in a lot of detail when we come to the derivative segment of this course. Now, talking about applications of derivatives, the fundamental applications of derivatives are listed on the screen. Speculation. In speculation, what you do is you take an open position in the derivative and you try to beat the market. Depending on what your perception is compared to what the market's perception is about the future of an asset or a derivative contract in itself, you decide to take a position which is contrary to the market expectations, and if you turn out to be correct and the market turns out to be wrong, you tend to make a windfall profit. That is what is called speculation. It is the taking of risk by an individual who is a risk taker, who is a risk taker he takes an open position in an instrument and depending on the future behavior of the instrument, if the behavior of the instrument is compatible with the perception that he had when he took up the investment, he could gain by beating the market. So, that is what is speculation. That is obviously a risk taking process. Hedging is the converse of this. In a sense, in hedging you already have an open position in an asset. For I will give you an example right in a minute, but you have an open position in an asset, and therefore, because you have that open position, you are exposed to the future price changes of the asset, and if the price change happens to be adverse to your open position, then you could lose out due to your holding of that open position. You are not happy with taking this risk of future price changes. You want to protect yourself against any detriment, any damage, any financial loss that may arise to you because of the future price changes, and you want to protect yourself. So, you want to create some kind of a insulation on that open position, such that the stimulus that is going to affect the future price change does not act on the set of that protection and the open position, and as a result of which the stimulus that causes the price change does not change the value of your hedged excuse me for using this word for the moment, does not affect your combination of the asset and the protection that you have taken up. That protection is known as the hedge, and this whole process is called hedging. So, hedging in a sense means a process whereby, given an open position, you take some kind of a position in a derivative, whereby by virtue of entering into a position in that derivative, you get insulated, you get protected from a price change, and the value of your exposure does not change, does not get affected by the market stimulus. So, that is what is called hedging. Let me now take a concrete example to illustrate this. Let us take the example of a student who gets admission in an American US university, and for that purpose he has been asked to deposit a certain amount of fees, say $2,000 at the end of 3 months from now. At the end of 3 months from now, let us say, and now it is June, let us say sometime in October. He is required to pay $2,000 in the first week of October to confirm his admission in a US university. So, one possibility that he can get about is that he can take that US dollars, he can buy the US dollars right away and keep them with him and then remit the US dollars in the first week of October when the need arises. But in that case, his position is that the holding of his US dollars is exposed to the price fluctuation. The second possibility that he can take is that he and in this first case, another important point that we need to highlight here is that if he buys US dollars now, his cash outflow on account of rupees will take place now, and if he keeps US dollars uninvested for the next 3 months, he loses out on account of interest that he has to pay on the US rupees, which constitutes an opportunity cost. And of course, if he has borrowed those INR Indian rupees, then of course that amount also has to be paid to the bank. Anyway, so the one thing is that he loses on account of, or he loses on account of interest, either explicitly or in terms of opportunity cost if he buys the US dollars today. Now, if he does not buy the US dollars today, what happens? He gets exposed to the risk. Suppose the US dollar price appreciates in the next 3 months, then obviously his payment in terms, his outflow in terms of Indian rupees will increase as per the increase in the exchange rate of US dollars vis-a-vis the Indian rupees. So, there again he is exposed to that particular risk. So, what he does is he goes to his bankers, he explains the entire position to the bankers, and he says that I want to buy the US dollars, but I want to buy the US dollars in such a way that I receive the US dollars from the bank at the end of 3 months, and I can immediately remit those US dollars to the US university. Now, if he does this, then obviously he is protected again, and the bank and this student agree upon the rate. The banker says, okay, I'll charge a small premium of say 1% on the current rate of US dollars, and on that basis I agree, I undertake to deliver to you 2,000 US dollars at the current rate plus a 1% premium, and the student also agrees. Now, this agreement eliminates the risk that the student was facing due to the price fluctuation, the exchange rate fluctuation of the US dollar. This is in fact a typical example of a forward contract, which is probably the simplest form of derivative, and this process is called hedging. Another typical example would be the case of a corn for a bread manufacturer. A bread manufacturer requires corn or wheat in order to create flour or grind it to flour and then prepare bread, manufacture bread. So, he may feel that at the end of 3 months from now he needs a certain quantity, say 100 quintals of wheat or corn, and he may like to protect himself against any price escalation of that requirement of corn at the end of 3 months. So, what he does is he takes up positions in the futures market, long positions, I will explain them later. He takes up positions in the futures markets, and such that if there is an increase in price of corn, he will be compensated by an increase in price of the futures contracts, and as a result of which again his risk on account of the increase in price of wheat or corn, as the case may be, it gets mitigated by taking a counter position in a derivative contract. So, these are typical examples where derivative contracts enable the protection of the investor's interest, the protection of the investor's exposure to stimuli that could operate on that exposure and result in value erosion. So, arbitrage is a very interesting process. Again, we will take it up in detail very soon, but arbitrage is a process where as the same commodity is being priced differently, differential pricing in two different markets. Then you could buy in the cheaper market and sell it in the dearer market, and thereby make up instantaneous risk-free profit. But the important thing is in arbitrage, which is usually ignored, is that when we talk about arbitrage, we need to ensure that both the transactions that constitute the arbitrage process, the buying and the selling process, do not change the risk level of the person who is undertaking the arbitrage. Let me explain this with an example. Suppose there is a particular share, let us say XYZ company, that is traded on both the BSE and the NSE. Let us say on a particular date the trading price on the BSE is say 110, and at a particular point in time it is 110, and on the NSE it is 100. So, what would you do? You would immediately buy that share on the NSE and at the same time sell it in the BSE markets. This process prima facie qualifies to be an arbitrage. Let us ignore transaction costs for the moment. Let us ignore brokerage, and let us ignore the borrowing lending spread also. Let us ignore all transaction costs. So, you buy the share immediately in the NSE market, and spontaneously you sell the share in the BSE market, and thereby you make a handsome profit depending on the number of shares in which you take up this transaction. But this is a typical example of arbitrage, but this would be arbitrage, only if there is absolute guarantee that you would receive the share at settlement from the NSE, and again you would receive your money when you deliver the shares at the BSE. Suppose there is some element of default in the some possibility of default, a very small possibility of default, whereas NSE transaction is absolutely secured, absolutely riskless. Let us talk about the BSE transaction. Suppose the BSE has 1% possibility of default in the receipt of payment against shares on settlement, then this would not qualify as arbitrage, because the risk level has changed. The risk level, this entire process is not totally risk free, because on the one hand you are getting the share, that is absolutely certain, but you are getting the payment, that is not absolutely certain. So, when you talk about arbitrage, this point has to be kept in mind, that the transactions that constitute the arbitrage should not affect the risk level of the arbitrager. Then there are certain types of derivative instruments which help you in changing the nature of an asset or a liability. For example, if suppose you require a certain amount of fixed rate funding for financing your fixed assets, you require some borrowing at fixed rate for financing your fixed assets. But when you approach the market for funding, you find that the market does not view your reputation, your credit worthiness as well, so very well, and as a result of which the fixed rate funding is at a premium, is at a high cost. However, if you consider the raising of money at a floating rate, because the floating rate is a short term rate usually rolled over, so the market could give you a slightly more favorable terms in terms of your borrowings. So, in that case what you could do is you could enter into an agreement with another party who requires the converse process, who requires floating rate funding, but in whose case the fixed rate funding is at a reasonably cheap rate. For example, a creditworthy strongly creditworthy institution where there is the investors feel that there is no risk of default at least for the next 5 years. So, in that case you could raise floating rate funds at reasonable rates, the other party could raise fixed rate funds at the discount rates or the cheaper rates, and then you could enter into a swap transaction, an agreement whereby you get your fixed rate funding and the other party gets a floating rate funding, and a certain amount of saving is achieved for both the parties, which can be shared by both the parties in a negotiated proportion. And that is called a swap. And so, we shall be talking more about these instruments later on in this course. A brief introduction to these 4 basic types of instruments: the forward contract, the futures contracts, options contracts, and swaps. When we talk about forward contracts, the example that I gave just now, a forward contract is a contract. Obviously, it is a contract, so it needs to satisfy all the requirements that are contained in the Contract Act. So, a forward contract is a contract between 2 parties whereby the 2 parties agree upon the terms of delivery of an underlying asset. That is, terms of delivery means all relevant terms that enable an unambiguous settlement of the contract. Settlement means delivery of the underlying asset and payment of the price therefore. So, the price of the underlying asset, the amount, the quality and the mode of delivery and all the relevant conditions that are required to facilitate an unambiguous settlement are agreed upon at t equal to 0, that is, let us say now, but the actual transfer of the underlying asset, the actual settlement of the contract, the transfer of the underlying asset as well as the transfer of payment, both the legs of the transaction are executed at a future date, which is called the maturity of the forward contract. So, in the case of a forward contract, we have a point in time t equal to 0 where the contract is negotiated, and another point in time, let us call it t equal to capital T, at which the contract is finally settled by transfer of the underlying asset and transfer of payment simultaneously. So, now, you need to contrast to understand this more thoroughly. You need to contrast it with a spot transaction. You go to the market, you buy an asset. What do? You locate the asset and you implicitly agree that this is the price of the asset. You pay the price and you receive the asset simultaneously. All this is done at a single point in time, and therefore, these are called spot transactions. The price is called the spot price or the cash price, because that is the price at which you are getting the asset immediately. The same process operates in the case of a forward contract. The only difference is, while the price and other terms are agreed at t equal to 0, the actual execution of the contract, the actual settlement of the contract is postponed to a future date. So, the dynamics are absolutely similar to what the dynamics are of a spot market, except for the fact that the delivery and the execution of the contract is postponed to a future date. This is what is a forward contract. Forward contracts are tailor made. In other words, they are not standardized. You, as I mentioned, if you get admission in a US university and you want to pay $2,000, you can go to your bank and you and your bankers will agree upon a rate at which the banker would be willing to pay you the US dollars at a future date. And you will have to pay the money again at a future date. So, that is a forward contract. The important thing here is that both the cash flow occurs at a future date. There is no cash flow at t equal to 0, except possibly for margin. If, for example, if you go to your banker in respect of the example that I just gave you, and the banker says, okay, please deposit an FDR covering 10% of the value of the contract as security, as safety, then that is a cash flow that is on margin account. Other than that, there is no cash flow at t equal to 0 in relation to the contract. The price of the underlying asset is going to be paid on the date of maturity of the contract, and the underlying would also be transferred to you on the same date. Now, because these are private contracts, there are two important things. Firstly, being private contracts, being tailor-made contracts, there is an element of risk of default on either party. Either party could possibly end up defaulting on the contract. That is one particular drawback of this in this forward contract, forward derivative. The second issue is, to counter what I have just said, is that if A and B enter into a forward contract at t equal to 0, both A and B have adequate opportunity to assess the creditworthiness of each other and thereby take appropriate remedial measures to protect themselves against default risk on the part of other party and embed that into the terms of the forward contract. This is a totally private contract between A and B. The world is obviously not involved in this contract. So, being a private contract, while on the one hand you get exposed to the default risk on account of the other party, on the other hand you also get the opportunity to assess the creditworthiness of the other party, because you know the other party. There are only two parties, you know the other party knows you. So, both of you can sit, do their homework and assess the creditworthiness of the other party, and on that basis develop a strategy to provide you adequate protection against the possibility of default by the other party. And this is very important. Why? We will come back to it. Now, let us talk about futures contracts. Futures contracts are absolutely analogous to forward contracts. So, what are for futures contracts? Futures contracts also give you a right to buy or sell, is an agreement rather to buy or sell an asset to another party at a price which is agreed upon at t equal to 0, which is agreed at the inception of the futures contract, and at a point in time which is also agreed upon, and other terms in relation to the delivery or the execution of the contract, the mode of delivery and so on, whatever the case may be, the mode of settlement, whether it is cash settlement or physical settlement as the case may be, all these things are agreed upon at t equal to 0. So, to that extent it absolutely mirrors the forward contract, absolutely parallel, but there is a fundamental difference. As I mentioned, a forward contract is a private contract. It is a contract between A and B and nobody else is involved in it, nobody else is interested in it. However, when we talk about futures contracts, there is a significant difference. Futures contracts are tradable. They are tradable like shares, they are tradable like commodities, whatever the case may be. Futures contracts trade on appropriate exchanges just like other underlying instruments like shares, like commodities like gold, silver, whatever the case may be. So, futures contracts are tradable. Now, forwards are not tradable. Futures are tradable, forwards are private. Of course, you can assign a forward contract in terms of the law of contract of the land. However, in the case of futures, they are freely tradable as per the electronic trading system in most cases in the exchanges which are created specially for the trading of futures in most countries. So, that is the fundamental difference. Now, how does this fundamental difference result in the manifestation of certain salient properties of futures contracts which are different from forwards? The first thing is that in order that there be adequate liquidity of these futures contracts in the markets, people would be willing to buy and sell these contracts need to be standardized. Standardized in terms of the underlying value of the underlying asset that they cover. Because if it were not so, to find a counterparty, for example, let us say your US dollar payment is 2,982 US dollars. How do you think it is going to be easily possible to find a counterparty who would be taking up the contra position, the short position in this contract, where you will buy the US dollars and you will pay Indian rupees? It would be very difficult. So, unless the contracts are standardized just like currency, the contracts would not be tradable very easily. Finding counterparties, you see, try to understand. When we talk about forward contracts, we are confining it to two parties which have already agreed upon, that is the end of the story. However, in future contracts, every minute, every day, every second there could be a change in the counterparty. Today you have entered in, you A and B have entered into a futures contract. Tomorrow A sells his leg to B and to C, and B sells his leg to D. Now we have a new contract between D and C. So, clearly, to find the counterparties who are willing to take positions or who are willing to take up your interest in a futures contract, you must have the contracts to be standardized. That is, only if the contracts are standardized, there would be adequate liquidity in the market, and finding counterparties to take up your positions in the futures contracts would be possible. That is one thing. So, that is one thing, the contracts must be standardized just like currency notes. The second thing is that I mentioned while talking about forward contracts just a few minutes ago, that A and B enter into a forward contract means A and B have had adequate opportunity to assess the credit worthiness of each other and thereby take adequate remedial actions, adequate precautions against the possibility of default by the other party. Now, in the case of futures contracts, what happens? A and B enter into a contract, then the next moment B transfers a leg of the contract to another party C, you may transfer your leg of the contract to another party D. Now, we have a contract between D and C. Clearly, D and C have had no opportunity of assessing the credit worthiness of each other. So, if the contracts were embedded with some sort of a default risk finding counterparties would again be very difficult, because the other party would not be knowing the status, the standing of the counterparty. You would have assessed the worth of the other party A, but the other party C would not have had opportunity to assess the credit worthiness of A, and therefore C would be reluctant to take up your position in the contract. This is also remedied by the exchange. What the exchange does, the clearinghouse of the exchange guarantees the performance of both legs of the contract. So, because the clearinghouse of the exchange is a hugely creditworthy party, the guarantee afforded by the clearinghouse of the exchange enables the transfer of contracts, the trading of the contracts without any inhibition, without any restriction. In other words, for all practical purposes, these futures contracts are traded default free. They are incurred or they are contracts without any risk of default. As far as the investors are concerned, as far as the market players are concerned who take positions in the futures contract. However, now the question arises, if some party defaults, what happens? Well, the default is to be borne by the clearinghouse, because the clearinghouse has guaranteed the performance of the contract. So, the clearinghouse must protect its own interests against the possibility of default by the parties, and this it does by the process of margining and marking to market. These two processes, margining and marking to market, operating in tandem, ensure that even the risk of the clearinghouse is completely mitigated, but we will talk about it later. So, here let us quickly recap the differences between forwards and futures contracts. Forwards are private contracts, forwards are customized, forwards carry one specified delivery date in most cases, forwards are settled at maturity by delivery, and forwards carry some default risk, carry some credit risk. In contrast to this, futures are exchange traded contracts, futures are standardized to facilitate liquidity. Futures may carry one or a range of specified delivery dates that depends on the nature of the contract. Futures are settled by marking to market on a daily basis, and they also have some kind of margining, by which, as I mentioned, the clearinghouse protects itself against the possibility of default by any party who has traded in the futures contract, who is holding a position in the futures contract. Futures are usually closed out before delivery. Now, in the case of forwards, because it is a contract between A and B, and A already, in most cases, A already has an exposure which it wants to cover, which it wants to hedge by entering into a forward contract. It is usually the case that forwards entail or forwards are settled by actual delivery of the underlying asset. However, in the case of futures, that is not so. In general, futures positions are closed out before the maturity of the contract. Of course, closing out means taking a reverse position in the contract of the same maturity and the same underlying. And as I mentioned, the futures contracts are guaranteed, the performance of the futures contracts are guaranteed by the clearinghouse, and as a result of which, the parties who take the positions, the two positions in the futures contracts, do not have any default risk as far as the counterparty is concerned. The clearinghouse operates as an intermediate. So, in effect, you see, a futures contract is broken up into two parts: a contract between A and the clearinghouse, and a contract between B and the clearinghouse. And in both cases, the clearinghouse guarantees the performance of the contract. So, neither A nor B faces the possibility of default by the counterparty. Now, we talk about option contracts. Option contracts are slightly different from forwards and futures. As the name signifies, option contracts embed an option, embed a choice. What is the choice? Well, as in the case of forwards and futures, the commonality is that both parties have, there are at least two parties to the contract, party A, party B. It may be so that one of the two parties buys the option contract, and the other party to the contract sells the option contract. Okay. So, what is an option contract now? An option contract is a contract whereby the party who buys the option contract, the technical term is long, the party who buys the option contract enjoys a right, is under that contract, he enjoys a right whereby he can either buy or sell an asset which is called the underlying asset, an asset at terms including price and other relevant terms at a date in the future which is called the exercise date. So, at t equal to 0, if you buy an option contract, what happens is you get a right to buy the underlying asset at a future date at a price which is already agreed upon at t equal to 0. Again, the terms are agreed upon at t equal to 0 as in the case of forwards, as in the case of futures. All the terms are agreed upon at t equal to 0, but the only thing is, the only difference is that the party who has bought the option contract, the party A who has bought the option contract, enjoys the right to exercise the option. What does exercising the option means? Exercising the option means that he will be entitled to buy the asset from the party who has sold the option contract. A has bought the option contract, therefore B must have sold the option contract. So, from the party B who has sold the option contract, A has the right to buy the asset at a price which is agreed upon at t equal to 0, which is called the strike price or the exercise price, on a date which is called the maturity date of the option. Of course, it can be before that date. There are different types of options. Let us keep it simple for the moment. So, an option contract contains a right. That means what? If one party has the right, naturally the other party has the obligation. So, in the futures and forward contracts, what happens was the parties A and B that enter into the contract both have obligations. A must deliver Indian rupees to B and B must deliver US dollars to A. So, both of the parties have the obligations to honor their legs of the contract. In the case of an option contract, it is slightly different. The party who has bought the contract has the right. That means what? That means he can either buy the asset at the strike price on the maturity date, or if he so feels, it is at his discretion that he can also afford to let the option go unexpired, just let the option lapse. The choice whether to exercise the option and buy the asset or to let the option lapse is rests with the party who has bought the option. But if the party who has bought the option decides to exercise the option, then party B who has sold the option must necessarily deliver the asset to A. So, the party B who has sold the option has no right, he has the obligation. The party A who has bought the option has a right, and he can exercise the right either to exercise the option, or he can exercise the right and say I will not exercise the option. So, that is party A versus party B in an operation. Now, obviously, because party A has a right, party B has an obligation, party A is at a superior pedestal, therefore, he must pay some money to party B to compensate for this superiority, and this is called the option premium. This is called the option premium which party A pays to party B in order that he gets that right, he purchases that right under the option contract. So, when you buy an option contract, you have to make a payment upfront, which is called the option premium, and thereby when you pay the option premium, you get the right to, and B, because he receives the option premium, he becomes obliged, mandated that he must honor his leg of the contract should you decide to exercise the option. Now, there are various varieties of options, we shall cover them later on. The right to buy is called a call option. If there is an option which has a right to sell, then it is called a put option. Finally, the fourth type of derivative that I will briefly discuss is swaps. Swaps involve, I gave an example of a fixed rate floating rate transaction. That was a typical example of an interest rate swap. A swap involves an exchange of cash flows between two parties. It can be considered as a series of forward contracts, as a sequence of forward contracts. It involves exchange of cash flows between two parties A and B. Usually what happens is one of the cash flows or the determination or the computation of one of the cash flows is tagged to a particular variable which varies in reference to some economic conditions, and the other leg of the contract is independent of that particular variable. For example, we had this floating rate leg and the fixed rate leg in the illustration that I gave to you just now. So, that is briefly all about derivatives. The next lecture I will talk briefly about hybrid instruments and then money market instruments. Thank you.